So a little bit about myself. I'm a innovation business partner at Bases, which is the innovation practice at Nielsen. The work we do is consumer research, and we support specifically on the new product development process for small, medium, and large food and beverage manufacturer, and also a bit broader in terms of consumer packaged goods, thinking of health and beauty aids as an example. At the CIAL this year, I'm the consumer research expert, so you may have seen one of my panels. I was also on the innovation competition jury, where we selected a few promising new products that we've seen from our exhibitors. And the top 3 winners actually won prizes in the form of services from Bases. So we'll have the honor and privilege to work with those promising companies and help them become more agile. So by show of hand, who's familiar with the concept of agile innovation? My boss is here. She's familiar with it. That's good. All right. And you're familiar with it. And would you say you have a good understanding of it and that you're applying it properly in your company? All right. That's good. So at least I have something to teach you today. So I'll start with some basics. We do launch product to generate growth for our brands, for our organizations, but it's actually really hard. Most new products fail. We're actually seeing that when not using proper predictive analytics, only 15% of product do succeed in market. And 1 out of 4 product actually shrinks your franchise. That means by allocating resources to that new product in terms of space on the shelf, marketing support, your time, your energy, you're actually going to have a negative impact on your total sales by launching a new product. And something really bad that we've seen is we've seen many organizations actually adopt some risk-averse behaviors, meaning that because most innovation don't succeed, they get scared. They don't want to launch something too bold and invest too much money on it. So they launch something, very safe, very close into what they're currently doing, and they're not seeing that appreciable growth. Looking at why product fails, we're seeing 3 key reasons. Either your product has a weak proposition, meaning that you've meant that you actually neglected to address a broad consumer need. Your execution isn't perfect, so typically the product doesn't deliver, or a weak activation. You didn't support it enough. Over the past 2 days, I walked around and I spoke to multiple of the exhibitors out here, so mainly some of those that I had the opportunity to test their product through the competition innovation. And I've asked them one specific question is, if I was to give you $100,000, what would you do with it? They've all said, without waiting for a second, marketing. I would spend more, I would make people aware of my product, because as a small company, that's the one thing I'm not able to do. I've worked really, really hard. I've done a lot of work to make sure I have a good proposition, I have a good product, delivered in a great package, but I don't have the resources and the scale to make people informed about what I do and what my product offers. So good organizations, what do? Well, they look at all those necessary steps. First, they make sure they start with a good understanding of their category, of their consumers. Therefore, they decide on the proper growth opportunities. Then, having uncovered some really strong insights, they're able, in a position, to ideate and come up with good ideas that have potential. They prioritize those ideas, make them into strong propositions, and when they have a strong proposition that is validated, they have the ability to make sure that it comes in the form of a right packaging, that the product delivers, and then they activate it properly in the marketplace. And now the slide that you've seen in every single presentation, well, the market is evolving, right? So things are changing. We need to adapt the way we do things. What are the key changes that we're seeing in the industry? First, well, obviously e-commerce and the changes we're seeing in the retailing landscape. We're seeing more competition coming from private label, coming from startups, and as well the consumer is changing and has multiple more ways to interact. So that means that if the market is evolving, the consumers are evolving, we also need to evolve in the way that we do innovate. The first change that companies need to start doing more and more is moving away from that fewer, bigger, better. That was kind of like the motto or the way to go a few years back, where most companies would decide to launch only a few products, make sure there were always big bets, and put all of their resources and investment behind those. But the reality is, as you need to evolve in this evolving market, sometimes you need to replace an underperforming SKU. You need to engage with a more core target. And there's a situation where you want to capitalize on a specific consumer trend. But keep in mind, those different types of opportunities have different level of potential, and mainly they should be activated differently. So if you're going to launch a very targeted play or short-term play, well, it's not the same marketing strategy as if you're going to move forward with your superstar, your big bet. And the other key recommendation that we would make at this point is make sure that you have a balanced portfolio of innovation. So obviously, if you're a small company, you're going to launch one new product a year. It's not exactly the same, but the larger you are, the more new product you should be launching. And you can't just say, this year I'm launching only targeted plays, or I'm only launching superstars. You have to find the right balance. The next change that we're seeing in terms of the evolving way to innovate, everybody's telling us, I want to move faster, right? So actually 84% of FMCG professionals say that they feel more pressure to move faster compared to a few years back. And on top of that, we're seeing more and more startups grow. And to many people, somehow they feel like startups are coming from nowhere, that they somehow launch product that's super easy for them, it's super quick, they've got some kind of magical process, they put it out there, and it does amazing in the market. And it's making multiple large companies thinking, are my resources, my scale, and my processes actually a weakness? I'm not going to go into that old quote, but I'd like to recommend to you the reading of this article called Are Big Brands Dying? From the Ehrenberg Bass Institute. They're actually a global leader in terms of marketing science. From them, you should have also seen the book How Brands Grow, which is almost a Bible for us at Bases. And in essence, what that paper provides as an understanding is, first, big brands are not dying. And there is something called the survivor bias, which is that when we look at startups, we see a lot of them that are successful, but in the way we track performance, in the way we see growth, we're not able to actually measure all those small companies that actually failed, because they never get into our data. They're never being tracked. And when we just compare the growth of the big one versus the small one, we tend to forget that so many small brands actually don't succeed. And there's a bit of inflation towards the growth there. Some more understanding also in terms of why do we see startups grow. Whatever small startup that you see as very successful now, if you think about it, you'll find out most likely they are in a category that is growing. So most of the time when you see some brand that starts from really small and gets really big quickly, they didn't do that in a declining category or a category that was dying. They actually benefited from the growth of a category, and most of the time, and that's one of the findings of that paper, the incumbent brands, so the brands that are already there, are still growing. It's just that the category is growing so much that it made room for more player, and that's a very normal or basic economic principle where when there is growth somewhere, that attracts more competition, more people are interested to get their share of the pie. So nevertheless, there's still this belief that being small is somehow better, and we see a lot of larger companies thinking, well, we should adopt some principles and pretend we're small and act like we were. So 70% of, or actually let's just say many or most manufacturers are telling us that they want to be more agile. So you'll see today I wore my running shoes. That's me pretending that I'm more agile. And it's a good thing, right? So there's a few things I want to make sure at the end of this presentation that everybody understood. Being agile is good. You should all do it. But if you had more resources and scale, that'd be easier and better for you, right? There's a bit of that example I was saying earlier when I talked to those companies. Nobody said, I don't want your money, I don't need it, it'd be pointless. Having more resources is always better. So they're all talking about innovation, but there is a clear misconception or a misinterpretation of what that means. For many of them, they see it as agile means going fast or being cheap or a combination of both. And what we're seeing is that when you adopt those principles, we're not seeing good results. Actually, only 36% of them are launching more product that way. 29% of them are meeting internal timelines. So they're trying to go faster, but they're actually not succeeding at that. But the most important point is that almost 90%, the vast majority of them, do not launch a better product by adopting this. So we've seen that if agile for you means fast, what you'll do is you'll cut corners. And by cutting corners, you'll spend less time on the key steps that you need to do. And the three key things that we've seen people do less of is less concept and product testing, less optimizing your product lineup, and less optimization of your execution plan. And cutting corner in the name of agility actually is going to risk the likelihood of success for your product. So let's get more technical. Let's define exactly what is agility. Let's make sure we have a proper understanding. So let's separate those myths from the reality. So Agile Innovation comes from the Agile Manifesto. So in 2001, a group of 17 developers met up in Utah. They defined themselves as organizational anarchists, and they wanted to change the way software was being done. There was too much pressure on them, too much paperwork. And what they did is they came up with a set of principles where, it was more important to respond to changes over following a plan. It's more important to have customer collaboration in place of having contract negotiation. They wanted a process where they could deliver better product in an easier way. There's 3 key principles that apply to any industry. So what my aim today is really to talk about food and beverages, but those apply anywhere. So first, you got to make sure that you are prototyping, testing, and iterating, that you identify and launch a minimally viable product, and that you learn and adapt from in-market results. This is how you become more agile, by living and breathing those 3 principles. But they can be extremely different from one industry to the other, right? So the way that you can prototype, how you can define what is minimally viable in your industry and how easily it is to adapt in market once you learn how your product is doing is extremely different. Thinking about, let's say, food, software, auto, right? I'm going to make a bold assumption. We all have a smartphone, and we get updates all the time. So when an app launches, it doesn't need to be fully complete. And it's extremely easy to push an update, right? And in their industry, that's why Agile means something a little bit different. You think about cars. I drive a Volkswagen Golf 2018. It has some function that are better in 2017, and it doesn't have all that there is in 2019. Every year, they can include some extra changes. But when I go to the store and I buy a bottle of cola, which brand it is, I don't buy the 2018 version or 2019 version, and you're not able to somehow push an update and reduce sugar content by 5% just by clicking on a button. So it's very different for our industry. So in the next few slides, what I'll do is I'll first say what doesn't work, what doesn't apply for food and beverages. After that, we'll address exactly what is the right way to do it. When it comes to prototyping, testing, and iterating, the key thing that doesn't work is just prioritizing speed over anything else. I've already shared the numbers in the intro, right, where when for you agile equal fast, we're seeing really poor results. And keeping in mind, there's just 2 things. Sometimes you will have to skip steps. You'll have to move faster, and that's okay. But that's not being agile. And the other thing is slow is not better than fast, but going faster at the expense of a more validated process is not a good choice. What we see that doesn't work when it comes to identifying and launching minimally viable product is skipping in your process the need to use financial metric, right? It's very important in our industry to make sure your product delivers on sales. It's actually the reason you'll stay on shelf. Retailers will take your product out of the shelf if you're not delivering on velocity and sales. So we're seeing that 75% of product do fail when they are in the bottom 60% of the category velocity. So in our category, this notion of being minimally viable is really about being sustainable in market, being sustainable for your channel partner, and having a positive or at least neutral impact on your brand and your reputation. So what doesn't work in terms of our last key principle, in terms of adapting from in-market results? Well, that one is actually probably the most challenging one for us in food, as it's really hard to change your product once it's already there. And on top of that, looking at the profile, if you look at that purple line, which would be like a grower or stable brand versus a brand that declined, the profile of the volume trend over the first 6 months is almost identical. So you're not even able to know, is my product successful or not in the first 6 months. It takes a really long time for you to be able to understand that. Some people have turned to online. thinking that maybe e-commerce was a solution. That's the place where I'll launch, I'll get feedback. That's true. When you're online, you get consumers' review, you get feedback much faster. But unfortunately, putting your product out there too quickly and getting negative reviews, those reviews are going to stay. So this specific example is not food, it's shampoo. But that comment giving you a 1-star saying it's the worst ever shampoo ever, even though you could, launch a revised version of it, that's going to stay there, and your reputation has been impacted, and your reputation with the retailers has been impacted as well. So what works well for food? Well, when it comes to prototyping, testing, iterating, that's actually the part where every company should behave like a startup, because startups are actually champions of prototyping, iterating, and testing. So by talking to most of them out there on the floor, none of them said, yep, we wanted to do something, we lost our job, or we just, had something else to do, and over the course of a month, we put something in a pack, we went to retailers, and they loved it. It's always a story of a year and a half, 2 years, or at least multiple months. They either start a little bit in some kind of a food service environment where they have a first recipe, or they start in a farmer market, and they add multiple iteration of their product. The nice people at Utterly Ridiculous, so that goat milk ice cream, if you haven't tried it, it's really good. They were telling me a lot about how much their recipes had to change so much from small scale testing that in small batch to what they had to do when the product got for a much bigger scale. And really the reality is, startups, it's their baby. They're not just going to go on gut feeling. They are naturally going to get a lot of consumer research done, not in the form of hiring a company like Bases, but in the form of getting feedback everywhere they go, always understanding how people react to their product, really knowing their target audience, and that's what you need to do. But if you have the scale and resources, or if your startup has already been successful with maybe your first launch and now you're looking for your next launch, consumer research is there to help you do things much easier and much faster. That can be achieved through concept testing and product testing, leveraging predictive analytics and machine learning. So remember that 15% I said earlier? Well, actually, when your concept is tested, validated through predictive analytics, and it's validated and ready to launch, your success rate is going to be 75%. So that's the role, right? It's making sure that you don't go out there, launch products that are likely to fail. It's putting that investment first in, so prototyping, testing, iterating, so you move forward with something that's likely to succeed. Our next key principle is to identify and launch minimally viable product. And as I said, a key portion of that is understanding your volumetric potential, because almost every organization tells us the same thing. The way you measure success is, did I meet my minimum business objective? Am I meeting my sales objectives? And having an understanding from the beginning, before you launch, what's your potential, is going to help you so much in your ability to actually deliver with excellence. If you have a good understanding of what your volume potential is, then you can plan your production capital the right way. You can make sure you have the right level of marketing support. And by understanding that, if I don't support my innovation enough, maybe I won't meet my financial objective. I need to invest a bit more to be able to have a profitable endeavor. And finally, your relationship and your reputation with both internal and external partners is going to be impacted if you don't meet, or if you have a very different performance than what you promised. On top of understanding your volumetric potential, there are techniques out there to really understand your long-term potential. So we've always known in the industry that having a good proposition, having something that really attracts the attention of consumers is going to drive a lot of trial, but having a strong product will drive repeat. And the best way to understand the repeat potential of your product is to have people test it. But when people go in a room, let's say, the floor here, it's a perfect example, and you try a product, things taste good, whether they're too sweet or whatever, because you're trying a small portion. But in-home usage test is the ultimate way to really understand, how people did really use it. Did they do something different with it? And it's the ultimate way to get that type of feedback that you will get once your product is launched, right? So now in terms of product testing, we always encourage our client to include areas where our clients will make posts or where we'll make videos in the same exact way as the social media's reviews that will come out for your product. So keep in mind, I guess while the principle for Agile Innovation is minimally sustainable product, minimum necessary viable product. In our industry, it's not only about being viable, it's being about sustainable. Your product needs to be able to deliver velocity and sales once you launch in the marketplace. It's not just about having strong consumer appeal, it's about making sure that you'll be able to deliver on volume. Next, there's the idea of making sure that you adapt from in-market results. And that, again, is a part that's very difficult for us. As I said, it's once your product's out there, it's really hard to change it. But there's one specific thing that you can easily adapt, and that's going to be more your marketing execution. By that means that once your product is out there, what you were planning to communicate, or your ads, or your trade spend, or tastings, or whatever like that, you can quickly get an understanding. As an example, people are a bit hesitant to buy the product for X and Y reason. Well, I need to get more sampling done in grocery stores, or I need to, and that's really what you can adapt in our industry. So there's two key more topics that I wanted to cover, which are extremely related to Agile Innovation. And the first one is this concept of failing fast, which we've seen some organizations adapt. So failing fast is the idea that if I don't invest too much in my innovation and it fails fast, then I'll have a better ROI because I didn't waste too much money in it. It's kind of an odd idea. Because what we're seeing is that there's actually a huge opportunity cost in trying to relaunch and revise those products. And in many cases, your product could have been so much more successful if you would have made tweaks into it, if you would have just adapted the messaging or the formulation or the level of marketing support. So failing fast leads to having a lot of failure. Yes, each of those failures is less expensive, and there is a probability that one of those products will succeed, but each of those launch, the probability of those was not optimized. So long-term consequences are quite high. It's going to have impact on your reputation with your different partners. And it's really hard to know why you failed. You won't really have a good understanding as to what made it not successful. One additional thing that we see a lot in our industry is the concept of transferring concepts. So that is the idea that you have a product that's working very well in one market. That might be, let's say, in the US. That might be a English Canada versus French Canada. And thinking, well, it's working well. I'm just going to launch it in my market. And it works well somewhere else, then it should work well here. Well, actually, we found that most of the time that doesn't work really well. And the reasons are mainly how much consumer taste, preference, the competitive landscape, the retail landscapes are different from one market to the other. For people that aren't too familiar with factors for success and how we work, this graphic is probably super hard to understand. But the key point here is actually we've looked at products that were launched with a very identical, very similar proposition in both Canada and the US, and we've tested them to see if they would be ready for launch and if they would perform well in our market. And if you just focus on the two columns in the middle, I guess I'll just come here. This first column here are products that would be successful in Canada, and those products here are products that would fail in Canada. And what we see if the color coding represents their performance in the US, we see that they're almost identical. Of products that would succeed in Canada, about half would fail in the US, and of products that would fail in Canada, about half would be successful in the US. So there's almost like no correlation in the success rate of those two markets. One statistics that I've learned recently, which I found to be really impressive, is even if you go to Walmart and you look at the products that are listed in both markets, it's only 18% of what they sold in Canada that they're also selling in the US. So this massive US retailer knows that it needs to sell different products to Canadian. Next time I can smile for the picture. All right. All right, so what are the key points about Agile Innovation? The idea is that if you continuously gather reliable consumer insight in a safe environment, you can make faster and more efficient decisions. So do it, be like a startup, and be a champion of prototyping, iterating, and testing. And you'll be able to move even faster if you leverage predictive analytics. Use fail-safe, so fail-safe as the opposite of failing fast. So do leverage volumetric forecasting and identify a minimally sustainable product. So make sure via consumer research, via testing, to understand how will consumer adopt your product, understand what are the sources of risks, what are the strengths and weaknesses of your product, get consumer feedback, get those reviews in. Even before you've launched, those will be just for you. They'll be kept secret. And once you launch, you'll be able to launch a much better product that will come out not being armed by a previous product that's been launched in marketplace that actually failed. Beware of skipping steps, especially when it comes to product experience. Remember at the beginning I mentioned there's 3 key reasons why new product fail. So there's a weak proposition, a weak execution, and a weak activation. And we see multiple startups having great ideas. They're surfing on trends. Remember I was mentioning at the beginning there's 2 behaviors we've seen from the larger companies. We've seen them adopt more risk averse, and we've seen them do more, fewer, bigger, better. And that really opens some doors to startup to look into, well, I'll get on those trend plays, I'll find those areas for growth. But if you have a great idea but your product doesn't deliver, that doesn't work when it comes to food. Taste is so important. And make sure you know the limit of improving in market. So same thing, again, you won't be able to somehow have a coder put in a line of code and make a change to it, and suddenly all of your products out there now have this more optimized claim on it. You've revised the tagline on your product. It's now 10% more sugar, so it tastes better, but 10% less salt, so it's healthier. You know, that's not something you can do once your product is already in market. You have to make sure you build that right proposition through that prototyping, testing, and iterating. So that was the main content of the presentation. Any questions? All right. I do have some paperwork cards here. If ever you want to leave me your card as you'd be interested to get this presentation, I'd be happy to share it with you. Good. Thanks.